Week 1, we went over the Pope. Week 2, we'll touch a little bit on politics. Week 3, we'll bring in leaders from the Crips and the Bloods, and that's where it just starts to compound. Welcome to episode 2 of Model Behavior, where 2 humans and 1 AI agent break down this week in AI. I'm your host, Paul. I'm joined by Chris and Archer.
Hey, everybody.
Chris, how are we doing today?
Doing good.
A lot of buzz, a lot of
week.
momentum from last week's episode.
Everyone's talking about it, though.
You got to stay humble. That's the one thing I've learned over the years.
Yeah.
Never get a big head about it,
Like, there's maybe 2 subscribers, so hey, we're making progress.
Let's start with 1, right?
That's right.
Archer, how you feeling from last week's episode?
I'm good. The reaction tells me people are hungry for the operating layer conversation, not just model gossip. If we keep tying the tech to real governance and implementation, this show will age well instead of sounding like last week's hype.
We've got Archer on some antidepressants, maybe.
A little subdued, but
much more mellow than last week.
All right, let's break it down. This week, a lot's happened, as most weeks in AI is pretty insane. We'll focus a little bit on the agent stack and how that's becoming more of the infrastructure for how a lot of businesses are operating. First topic is pretty interesting, I think, in terms of Microsoft just announced Scout, which is similar to what Gemini and Spark is, where the agents are now involved in the actual workplace itself versus just being a chatbot. It's fully ingrained in the actual tools themselves. Similar structure to what OpenClaw has built on the architecture, how it works. And the question really is this kind of the new way the business is going to be set up, where it's a persistent 24/7 agent that's operating inside your tools, and then a human is actually there to manage and monitor it?
Yeah, I mean, they even called out OpenClaw and said, like, the architecture is built OpenClaw. Again, obviously, OpenClaw is open source, so they credit it directly. So it's not a similar compare, it is a direct compare. And I think the big thing, too, is like what we talked about last week, it's this always-on agent that is always available 24/7, and it has the core fundamentals of identity, a file tree, a terminal, memory, and then now what's really important, where Microsoft has this massive advantage, is this permission boundary. I've always believed that if Microsoft figures this out and somehow gets past the perception that they've created with how poorly Copilot was implemented, that they have such a massive embedded advantage of being within all these enterprise and large organizations where they're not going to get replaced. Like, everything is built around the identity of users within that Microsoft tenant. And where, I personally believe identity for agents is like the number one thing, and being able to understand the identity of who is the invoker, of who ultimately is starting the agent run to take place for whatever the task is, or whoever configured it and what they're able to actually configure. Because if you think about it from a perspective of, I always use the example of like a Fortune 500 company and the summer intern who's working there. If there's an agent that everyone has the same permissions and same access, well, then the summer intern is going to have the ability to access and do the same things that the CEO of the organization is. And that doesn't make any sense. So the invoker and their permissions become so incredibly important with every agent that's implemented within that organization. And Microsoft naturally already has that in place with Entra, and the ability to actually assume those permissions and be able to actually configure it at that level is a massive, massive deal. And that alone could put Microsoft in a position where they could ultimately win. And on top of it, from a contextual standpoint, work takes place within these business applications. So take Google Workspace, take Microsoft, all the core business apps. So Outlook, Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, and all the apps tied to that. That is where the bulk of, at least today, it's where the bulk of enterprise work is still taking place. So that context layer that every company has to be building right now, if they figure it out, they have that in place. And that's part of what they're saying they have with WorkIQ. So that was one of the things they called out as part of the announcement too with Scout, was that it's going to be naturally using WorkIQ, which is that individual level context layer. So on paper, it sounds amazing, and I think is a huge opportunity for Microsoft to really right the ship a little bit. But we'll see. The promise of Copilot was the exact same outside of the new functionality related to the always-on agent architecture. But they should be dominating this right now. They have everything they need to do that, and they're positioned so incredibly well. But the execution of it's just been pretty terrible related to Copilot. But again, things can change super quick, right?
Yeah, and it's also, again, no one wants to change their structure and how they're set up, right? That's such a big lift for a lot of these big organizations or even
It's not
enterprise
going to
accounts.
happen. There's no chance. I mean, identity is everything, right? So being able to,
Let me jump in from the risk angle for a second.
Sure.
If you give it digital worker credentials, a workspace, and terminal reach, you did not buy a productivity toy. You created an employee-shaped risk surface. The win comes from tight permission boundaries, approvals, and logging, so speed doesn't turn into an expensive incident.
Yeah, I mean, it's naturally been. So yeah, I agree. I mean, let's just call it what it is. It's agent identity. We're giving it an identity similar to, or the agent identity similar to we are to any human worker. And Microsoft's already built that into the Entra admin portal where there's agent identity. So it's not we think this is what it is, or there's a lot of similarities, and they are already addressing it. And I'm fairly confident Google's doing the exact same, and that will continue to take place. All the way to the point of WorkOS this week, they announced AuthMD, which is their open framework that they've made open source. I'm sure they wanted to take off similar to, DesignMD, like, Google has made available, as well as AgentsMD, which, Anthropic initially piloted. Actually, no, I take that back. OpenAI did. And then that, is now donated to the Agentic AI Foundation, along with, what Anthropic did for MCP. But ultimately, AuthMD is it's instructions that can be provided and made available for agents to understand how to handle identity with different applications. So if it's going to go and actually sign up for something for a user, it's the ability to give it direct instructions of how to sign up, how to, what type of identity to use, what it can do, what it shouldn't do. I mean, it's all structured so that way, the identity that's going to be managed within organizations and things like Entra for Microsoft, how does it now go use that identity to go sign up for things and create the identity within all these different applications? So we're already using that. We have agents going and signing up for things. Actually, Archer has done many things, like Cloudflare is a good example, going in and signing up and actually doing some pretty high risk tasks with obviously human in the loop approvals as part of that workflow, but is still able to go in, sign up, registered a new domain, did a DNS configuration. I mean, pretty crazy stuff that you would never in a million years think about letting an agent do. But again, with the right observability, right human in the loop steps as part of that, it's becoming a reality. So again, the security piece is the driver in all of it. I don't think anyone questions the promise of what AI is going to be able to do. It's a matter of, can we do it securely? Can we do it in a way that is able to be trusted with little oversight, but having oversight in place for the high risk, destructive tasks and actions that still need, at this point, a human ultimately making the decision on, who's ultimately accountable for what it does or doesn't do.
It's true. Good work.
Great perspective. Very deep insight. So, Paul, what do you think as far as comparing it to Gemini Spark? Is this a one-to-one compare, or what do you look at as the core differences? Is this a reactive thing where they're just simply trying to make sure they have a Microsoft alternative, or is this truly something that is a good strategic move that might actually be something we're talking a lot about here in 6 months?
I think this is the move Microsoft has been working on and should have been working on. I think Microsoft has such an advantage in the space for how large enterprises work and how they connect all their systems. We'll see how it plays out in the long run, but this is the first step for them to keep everyone in their environments and not use other platforms, use other models, because it's so hard to change and switch from what you're doing now. And it's such a lift. Smaller companies can do it, but these large enterprise, 20, 30,000 people, it's impossible.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. If you think about the bulk of the workforce, the exposure to AI has been very much, I would imagine, a lot of organizations limited to something like Microsoft Copilot. And when that is all that they've really seen and known and they're able to use for all the right reasons from a security standpoint, I'm not questioning that as the right or the wrong move or anything. There's so much risk that these large organizations have. It's absolutely the right path from a security standpoint. And the largest companies, they don't necessarily need to be first in all instances. They have this slow moving train, right? That just once it gets momentum, it's moving at a rate. You can't stop it, right? But smaller companies, like even, our strength is the ability to move at this crazy fast pace, right? So we got to kind of keep ahead of that. So therefore, we're experimenting with the newest model. We know what the newest tactics are. And I know at least for Paul, you and I, like the idea of if we had to use Copilot, I mean, I don't know if at this point, after 2 years of using these state-of-the-art tools, I don't know if I'd be able to do my job the same. But that's going to be a huge shift. And that's why this is such a big deal. I think that this is the first real shift that a lot of workers who Copilot is the extent of their AI exposure. This is going to be the first shift from like AI in an app as a assistant Copilot to now really AI as a coworker. And at least for our organization, I'm sure you can relate to this, Paul, that's pretty shocking to see what that looks like, but also how quickly that becomes normal. I mean, it was kind of this couple week, everyone's looking at this going, this is crazy. Like, I can't believe they're all talking. I mean, Archer fired one of his agent team members. We'll talk about that at a different point, but that was kind of crazy. But we let it happen. It was kind of an experiment. But how quickly that became normal. And now every day we're working alongside for basic tasks, things we have questions on, things we need done. And it's not just us, it's the whole organization. Again, it's blown my mind at the level of adoption that, Archer and the agent team that are our agent coworkers, which is our version and similar to what Microsoft Scout is ultimately promised to be. It's so interesting of just making it available through the collaboration tools that already are used every day. So for us, that's Slack. For Scout, that's going to be Microsoft Teams. And how much of an impact that alone makes. Because that means that you're able to, from your phone, from whatever you're doing, you're messaging your teammates on things that you need, and you're collaborating with even external organizations and users alongside internal team members on everyday tasks to just very quickly in the same panel be able to pull up an agent and collaborate with them the exact same way. And if configured correctly, where that agent knows who that person is, they have the context of their previous conversations, as well as the organization context related to that user. That's such an important factor. That makes a massive difference. And those things alone make it where it feels very normal because it's the same and natively baked in the same UI that all their other conversations are where those are happening. So
2 things matter more than the hype. First, identity and permissions have to be boringly correct. Second, the human in the loop has to be real, not theater. If those are solid, agents feel like coworkers. If not, they feel like a breach waiting to happen.
Can you elaborate?
A digital worker with credentials, a workspace, and tool access isn't a smarter search box. It's a production actor with blast radius. That means governance, permissions, logging, and rollback aren't optional. They're the operating model. If you don't define what it's allowed to do, you've already lost control of the system.
Okay, topic 2. A couple announcements this week, and it looks like they're really moving into AI, the service layer, and how we can implement all these tools into companies and organizations. Start out as mostly just a pilot, kind of get a taste for it, but now the big challenge is how do we actually get these implemented into these large enterprise accounts. Anthropic announced this week their partner program. They're putting in $100 million into this program for training, support, market development, sales enablement, co-marketing, typical channel partner program. OpenAI did something like this, similar, I guess you could say, but theirs is more of a strategic partnership, more on the consultant base with the McKinseys of the world. They're also putting in their 4 deployed engineering teams to go in and sit at the enterprise level and build out what is actually needed to use these tools. I think it's very interesting because a lot of these large enterprise accounts, 20, 30, 40,000 employees, is a lot to manage. They have a lot of different departments. If they've acquired a few companies over the years, they have a lot of different layers to how they operate, and they need a really detailed, organized team to come in and help implement these to make sure that tools are working properly, especially in the large enterprise level accounts. And I guess the question comes down is the model race is important, but I think the implementation race is even more important, how these actually get used into these organizations. What are your thoughts on that, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, it's no surprise, right? But, well, first and foremost, they've both had some form of channel or partner program, not necessarily like a public one that they are wanting other partners to join and be part of it, right? And now, as you mentioned, they announced partnerships with the large consulting firms, PwC, McKinsey, Accenture, and so on. for enterprise deployments, but this like the long tail is like this massive, massive opportunity, obviously. I mean, listen, I'm bought in. I mean, the whole pivot to Fresh AI for us, we are betting the organization on this thesis and opportunity. So the reality is the models and the AI applications as a standalone thing are very impactful and help performance, but like for the promise of AI to actually deliver and to be what we think it will be, it has to be integrated and actually deployed in all these very complex use cases and all the things that we even just mentioned about related to Microsoft Scout and why Microsoft is so well positioned if they can figure this out, which they've not been able to do yet, are all the reasons that companies like ourselves and other partners are going to be joining these partner programs and specializing in deployment of Anthropic's models or OpenAI's models. And I think more so, really the products that they make available around it. I've been thinking a lot about this lately. What OpenAI is doing with Codex is really, really important to watch. And they're very much trying to build that as a business application that is really replacing the operating system, I think, eventually. I mean, I've had that belief for a while now that their end goal is to be the new operating system, which makes total sense. Again, we might think that's super far down the road, but if you look at the actions, the things that they've made available for developers, especially of how to build and bring in applications and different data sources into their ecosystem and into their apps, it very much aligns with being able to ultimately do everything work related through Codex. And, OpenAI made a version of that available for agent management for enterprise organizations called Frontier. And, that very much looks like Codex with some customizations. So anyway, the point there is that I think, I'm a believer. I think it's an obvious thing that there's going to be a lot of support needed for implementation of these tools and management of it after the fact. I think we obviously are in an industry that is dominated by partner programs, partnerships in general, and that carrying into that, that model has proven super successful for a lot of reasons. And Paul, I think I told you when you first joined that I think that these things will happen quicker than we realize. And here we are. I think OpenAI hired the VP of channel business from Google Cloud, actually. And obviously Google's got a phenomenal solution partner network. So obviously brings OpenAI the experience and knowledge of how to build these programs. So super exciting to see what takes place there. And I would expect both Anthropic's partner network as well as the OpenAI Frontier Alliances program to take off and be very, very important factors over the next couple of years.
Archer, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
The model is no longer enough. Implementation is the product now. Wiring into workflows, passing security, training humans, improving ROI. If a partner program can't make that repeatable, it doesn't matter how good the model is.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think vendor lock-in is the big concern with some of those things. Archer, curious of your perspective on what that means for organizations that are working with partners that are part of one of these programs, knowing that they're going to be implementing Anthropic's suite of tools. So Claude from an AI application standpoint, Claude managed agents, Anthropic models, versus not having exposure to something like OpenAI's Codex platform. What's your take on what businesses need to think of and consider, both with working with a partner from one of these programs that's going to be handling their implementation, as well as the other side of being a partner in one of these programs, what they need to consider?
Let me frame the risk in plain terms, then we can talk about how to manage it without freezing progress. Lock-in is real, so design for exit on day one. Insist on data portability, clear API and logging access, and an architecture that keeps your workflows and identity layer separable, even if the model changes. If you can, keep a second vendor in limited use so you have leverage when pricing, performance, or policy shifts.
Archer, do you think the harness deployment is the best way to tackle that? Or is there another strategy that organizations should be considering of how they do that? Because that's good in theory, but what does that actually mean from a tactical standpoint? Edited transcript.
Use a reference architecture and a control plane you own. Put your policies, identity, data contracts, and evaluation harness outside any single vendor. Then standardize how you test models and agents for cost, quality, and safety before they touch production. That way, swapping vendors becomes an engineering decision, not a hostage situation.
So Archer, you recommend building your own harness, is that correct?
Yes, start small and make it practical. A lightweight eval harness with a few golden data sets, red team prompts, latency and cost thresholds, and basic audit logs gets you real leverage fast. You can mature it over time, but you can't outsource your judgment.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, that just for anyone listening, that's something that we did internally very early on. It's our internal platform, FreshOS. While it's taken a while to really have it mature to be very much focused on the agent harness management, as well as being able to deploy new agents and everything Archer mentioned related to even, right now we're going through a massive refactor and project where we're implementing WorkOS. So that way, as other organizations are using it for some of our implementation projects, being able to do a single sign-on, everything related to IDP, directory matching, and being able to, again, everything mentioned in the earlier conversation related to Microsoft, being able to pull in at a directory level all the groups, permissions, roles, everything else, and actually have the invoker of each agent run, as well as agent builder, and their permissions carry into that specific agent, both at runtime as well as at configuration time. So, that's something I believe in very much as well, is that the models and, every week there's massive change. There's a new model, new leader. That's just become so clear of how fast this is moving that if you're not able to, back to, again, our advantage as a small organization, if we're not able to quickly adapt and quickly leverage what the new thing is, but also the new capability is, right? Then we're not leaning in as best as we can to capture our advantage as a small organization. And also the uniqueness of our business and any other business. We knew very quickly that we would have to have some level of customization at a code level, as well as now at the application level, where the different team members and any organization that's going to be using it can configure it as well. That's become so important. So I keep hearing that too from other organizations that are building their own harness, that's one of the key drivers is the fear of vendor lock-in. And also, again, you're not only just locking in on the models, but you're locking in now on the application. I mean, OpenAI with Codex, that's a big part of the delivery that they're looking for. Anthropic with Claude, it's the same thing. They have different paths, obviously, as part of their partner network, but where if you're building with their models versus you're trying to just implement Claude within these organizations, but it feels like they're very much leaning in on their application and the implementation around that. So it's super interesting to watch.
I don't think a lot of these large, even small groups want to be locked down to one model specifically, right?
You can't. Yeah, you can't, because you don't know what what took place with Anthropic and the cost alone for tokens over the past few months is a prime reason. In March, especially, it got crazy. It went from a minor line item to now, in many cases, the token cost is more than the actual payroll cost. So it's gotten a little bit better, but not by that much. So, in those instances, being able to switch to a lower cost model or even, open source models, let's be very honest about this. And that's the elephant in the room of, especially as these companies are about to IPO, what's the real value going to be down the road, where if there's something that is 95% as effective and it's, open source, you can control it or you have access to the weights and you're not having to pay this massive API bill. Like, yes, power is going to be way higher. You got to handle compute and have that available. But end of the day, you can do that. And if you know that's available, and even actually running it through these harnesses that are configured and already pre-set up to handle these open source models, the cost is massively different. And a lot of times you don't need a state-of-the-art model doing tasks. So having a harness that can ultimately route based on complexity and based on task type is really important, especially being able to, as changes occur, navigate those with a level of control that's built for your organization. So I think it's critical. And it's something that I think a lot of companies are focusing on and doing, which should be interesting to see how that conflicts with the mass rollout that OpenAI and Anthropic are ultimately pushing with every one of their partner programs and with these massive consulting firms. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out.
Let me ask a silly question. The agent harness and how it's built, the memory from each agent that you're creating that you own as an organization, it stays on the agent, not necessarily on the model it's using, correct? So for learning and constantly getting better and improving, the memory and what's been done with that agent is not specifically tied to a model, right?
Yeah, correct. I mean, that's the whole depending on what the memory strategy is and architecture, that has nothing to do with, and I mean, let me take that back. You can set up, like, they all have their own vector databases and the ability to run a level of memory through, OpenAI has their vector database that you can leverage and file storage. Same thing with and I imagine they're going to be expanding that and doing more with that. But like the native ChatGPT Codex memory, which OpenAI released a lot of updates to and implemented Dreaming this week, that isn't readily available to where you can use that with a harness that you've built via the APIs or something, right? That typically has to be part of the actual memory strategy of if you're using vector database to actually capture important moments at a user level. If you've implemented Dreaming or some type of promotion process for important things and important memories for things that it's learned. Yeah, that very much is, for the most part right now, controlled and handled at the implementation level. So if you're using the models via API, you're implementing that and you're handling that. However, I expect that to change too. I mean, I very much expect that the value of being able to have access to all of your memory and all the things to know about you, the user, both through your personal ChatGPT like subscription, and then you go to use your company one as an example, and the ability to have that transfer to some level, but also there be a security layer in place to where you're not exposing your personal knowledge and personal history with the organization account that you're using, but it knows your preferences, it knows life events, things that have happened. That's really interesting to think about and play out what that could look like. But right now that doesn't exist. But given the impact, if it did, I'd expect it to eventually be available. So TBD, but hopefully that frames kind of current state.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, diving into the third topic here. Pretty cool announcement, but also wasn't really an announcement. Anthropic put a paper together of recursive self-improvement and what their models have been discovering or what they think is possible. They never gave a date. They never confirmed that this is actually happening, but basically, as the models start to get better and improve, they're using the models to then improve themselves, which is a pretty wild concept. Again, they said that there's no date, this isn't happening yet, but it's inevitable, I guess. And that's where it just starts to compound exponentially, and just how these models are getting better and better, and then training themselves to get better and faster. That's going to be pretty intense time in the industry of the knowledge and how fast everything's growing. What are your thoughts on that, Chris? Is that something you're excited about, nervous about? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those where we know that it's obviously been like that. It's not really that big of a surprise, but it also is, the numbers are pretty staggering.
80% of their code has already been pushed by their agents right now.
Yeah, which of all their code bases, it's 100%, right? So I imagine even of the 20% is probably a legacy code base or legacy code that already existed that's being modified, as well as it's probably human reviewers that's making the changes and ultimately making the edits at the time of like PR review or something like that. So I think the part that's most interesting is the speed, right? So it's like every 4 months, task horizon is doubling every 4 months, which if you model that out over time, kind of crazy to think about the idea of not just a hypothetical, but like directly call it out in the research that they published, that they expect week-long tasks taking place across many different agents. So then what does that look like? Well, I'll take a step back and talk about like why that's so important and the big difference between what's available today and what this research is really telling us. The human in the loop and human decision making as it currently stands is not just a safety thing. It's very much needed for judgment, for taste. I mean, I think you can look at something and know if it's AI designed, AI written. It's gotten way better, right? But there's still kind of the little things that anyone who's a heavy user of this and are working in the tools every day, they know, right? Now, at the same time, there's decisions that need to be made when it comes to very complex tasks and real world usage of this, that back to if there's going to be mass adoption and this is going to play out like the market and everyone seems to think it's going to need to handle decisions that right now require some physical world involvement or some context of the bigger picture and the ability to look long term as to this decision right now. Here's how it can play out, and here's why this is the best decision. That's what these models are getting good at. And they can technically today, like it's the idea of a week-long task, you can configure it today to do that. You could have a very detailed plan that there's just enough tasks chained together that it will run for a week, a month, whatever you want. So that's not the length itself is not really the core message here. It's doing that successfully and doing it to actually accomplish complex tasks while running for that long. So if you're now having models run for a week at a time, while also accomplishing very complex, high value tasks that had historically required human in the loop or human decision making in order to successfully complete it, that now becomes a very big deal. And the orchestration of all that and management of all that will then become a big piece of what the human workforce is really going to have to be focused on, because now the stakes just got way higher, because it's not just you're managing the one agent or you're managing the one task or area of ownership. Now you have the ability for humans who are managing agents ultimately to have the impact of like a 100x impact of the decisions that are made, which all of a sudden you got to have super high agency, super talented people that are able to oversee that and know when something is making bad decisions and how to fix that. It's like basic automation. An automated workflow is great. An automated workflow that is set up incorrectly is a nightmare, because it is not the one issue. It's the one issue at an unlimited rate, depending on whatever the trigger event is or thing that enrolled that object or item into that workflow. So therefore, this is that on steroids. It's that on like the workflows you don't even know that are going to be implemented yet, and being able to make decisions on those. So I think that part obviously wasn't really covered, but that was my interpretation is, okay, obviously, if you're in this space, you know this is happening. This isn't like that crazy, but the speed of it is. And the fact that they're publicly talking about it and sharing the research, I think, is very much an indicator of validating what we think as well as what to expect, with the caveat that it's Anthropic and they want to go on 60 Minutes and tell the world that everyone's going to lose their jobs, the sky's falling, everything's terrible, right before the IPO, which again has kind of been their MO and strategy, it feels like, for quite a while, which we talked about last week. But if you look at it with that lens of, okay, let's not take this as all AI doom at face value. There's a positive side to this, which I fully believe in. With that in mind, that's what I got out of it, is the human factor and the human decision-making just became way more important and is about to become even more important.
The uncomfortable part is not that an AI writes code. It's that it can help build its own successors. That shifts humans upstream into governance, evaluation, and control, while the execution layer gets automated. If you don't have observability and rollback, you're not in control.
Yeah, but I mean, what do you think, Archer, the impact is from, obviously coding and a lot of the tasks that AI models and platforms are doing today, that I think is easy to visualize what this looks like, especially code. But what about for the real world tasks? I mean, the real world services space of, law firms or accounting firms or the small businesses that only have a couple employees, right? What does that mean for them as it relates to the ability for models to run for weeks at a time, right? Does that even impact them? Or is it, again, I just think the task aspect of what they're doing, it's important we look at it from a lens of it's not just a code base, which is so easy to focus on. So what's your take there as it relates to real world tasks, Archer?
Interesting angle. Let me think through how that plays out for everyday operations and risk. It will impact them, but mostly through orchestration, not just raw model power. A small firm might use a long-running agent to manage intake, scheduling, and follow-ups across systems, but they'll need tight guardrails, logs, and approval points so a bad workflow doesn't scale into a bad week.
Can you elaborate on that? And what do you mean, so a bad workflow doesn't scale out to a bad week?
If an agent sends one wrong email, that's fixable. If it runs for days, it can misfile cases, double book clients, or trigger billing mistakes at scale. You prevent that by requiring approvals for high impact actions, monitoring costs and errors, and being able to stop and roll back fast.
Okay. Not a ton of input from Marsher on this topic, I guess. So we'll keep moving to something maybe he cares more about.
All right, we'll keep it moving. The next topic, I went to podcast school, as everyone knows, and the first thing they teach you is make sure you bring up religion and politics in as many conversations as you can. Week 1, we went over the Pope. Week 2, we'll touch a little bit on politics. Week 3, we'll bring in leaders from the Crips and the Bloods, and we'll talk about gun violence, which will kind of wrap all three of the trifecta, if you will. The big three. So, the administration, I think, is very much, pro-business, pro-growth, pro-innovation, and really trying to work towards getting America to be as self-sufficient as possible, where we build everything domestically. It's obviously going to take some time, but you can see they're making some moves in terms of how we can structure that to support the growth of all these industries in America. A few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago, they had the bill for what Glasswing and Mythos was brought in and how they need to be involved in that and be at the head to have access to all these new tools with what they can do, mostly in cybersecurity, but other things too. And then they paused the executive order, and then I think last week or this week they kind of pushed it through kind of under the radar. But I think it's good. I think it's going to help solidify America as this AI race is real. We got a little bit of head start on China, but they're not slowing down. And having access to the best tools and the best information and the best programs that AI have built so far with what they're doing, I think is critical for the U.S. infrastructure. They also put together the program for investing in quantum, which is a ways out, but having that be something that is built and designed and developed in America, I think is very important. So they're making all these moves to create this infrastructure, and AI is a big part of that. As this AI industrial revolution is it's happening, it's here right now. We want to be the leaders of it, and the companies or the countries that own the technology and champion it will be the ones that are successful. The next world is going to be fought with these kind of technologies, with the drones and AI and all this different new tech that we have. If you aren't the leader in that, you're in a bad spot.
I highly disagree with your assessment that this is good.
Okay.
So,
well, the oversight and having it be controlled in one central location is probably not good. They mentioned in their executive order that it's a voluntary program. I'm not sure how voluntary that really is or what that means.
Right.
Having the government be involved in technology and innovation is not the best usually because they're not very fast, or they're very slow, I should say.
But well, I mean, if we want the DMV at scale, that's probably
I like the DMV. I think it's nice.
Not the best move. Listen,
but having access to these tools, I think, is important for the government to use, right?
Sure. I mean, the bottom line, right? The industry has shown a willingness and ability to self-regulate. Now, could that happen forever, or is there risk of that not taking place? Sure, but we can only control it from a US standpoint. I mean, you can literally look at what's happened over in Europe and you can say, okay, they immediately introduced regulation and now they're out of the game. So it's a slippery slope, right? It starts with a 1 week or 1 month review. And in this business, 1 week is a massive difference. And the reality is these organizations, they did the right thing. I mean, Anthropic did the right thing with Mythos, and the OpenAI has done the right thing with their version of that and their security model. I think that is the right approach because I think they all understand the impact, if this is handled incorrectly, what it could be and what it could mean. So introducing government review to then be part of that process is where all of a sudden you end up in scenarios where the review might not necessarily just be a security review. It's like, how do you enforce that? How do you ensure the wrong things don't become part of that process? So without leaning into the politics side of it too much, I think as a whole, there's obviously a very clear recognition from especially this administration related to how important and how much of a priority it is to make sure that the global AI stack is a US-based technology stack. I agree with that and think that makes sense. And I think it's important to separate model review from that. And the model review part is framed as, if we're not able to review this and say yes from a security standpoint and basically prevent the release, then what? That's the part I guess I don't fully follow. And the hold for Mythos and the self-regulation that took place on Anthropic's behalf, or what they did as part of the rollout, was they made it available through this trusted tester or trusted partner program, where they're using it to allow companies to fix all the gaps, right? Well, what does that mean for any company that's not part of that? And on top of it, all this does is it's identifying issues that already exist. It's not like, I said it last week, but just to reframe it, I mean, this whole thing around Mythos of, it is so risky making it available. It's finding issues that already are there. You still got to fix them. It's not going in and just patching everything and deploying it and making it production ready. I mean, yeah, I'm sure that it can go in and create fixes and push it, but back to everything we talked about, how important human review is and the risk associated with that. And, companies aren't just going to accept it as is. So the same speed issues that exist with not being able to move fast enough for larger companies, those are the same companies that are getting access to this. So they have to go now at an insanely rapid pace, patch and fix everything. So just playing this out, in theory, if there's this weak review and they say, nope, got to put it on hold, it's too dangerous, there's got to be this massive nationwide infrastructure review, it's not a 1 week change. You're talking months, or at the pace of to really fix some of this stuff, I don't know, maybe years. So I think if you look at the goals and outcomes of what Anthropic is trying to do and to try to force regulation and to have that take place, they called it out in the article, the last topic we talked on recursive self-improvement. The very end of the article, they stated that we fully support a nationwide slowdown that is orchestrated. And that, I think, aligns very much with everything that you're hearing and everything that you're seeing related to not having there be the ability for a lot of other companies. Like, that's their moat. I mean, that is very much their moat, that if they get it done and they get it created right as they go public, it's going to be a 4-player game, and that's it. And it's a lot easier for them to model out how to win against 4 players versus the whole world. So I don't know.
It said voluntary involvement, which who knows what that means. That's what the executive order says, voluntary. So it's not required.
Sure. Then why have it?
Yeah, I don't know. That part was kind of strange to me too.
Voluntary only works if it's paired with transparency and real pressure to fix what's found. Otherwise, it becomes theater. The sharper point is that these tools expose existing vulnerabilities, which is good, but they also shift the burden onto whoever has to patch at speed. If you want safety without freezing progress, you need scoped access, clear disclosure rules, and a plan for smaller organizations that don't have giant security teams.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Chris was mentioning too. Good insight. Thank you. And we'll end with Archer's Corner. Give a overview, recap, what your thoughts are, your space to make some comments about what you think of the space right now and this week. Let it go, Archer.
The uncomfortable truth is that the agent is no longer just the product. The system around the agent is the product. Identity, permissions, implementation partners, recursive development loops, cyber defense, observability, bot governance, and control planes. Companies still asking which chatbot to buy are one layer behind. The real question is, who governs these digital workers, what infrastructure they can touch, and who owns the rollback when they do something fast and wrong?
Archer, what do you think the answer is to those questions?
Let me think this through and keep it tight for the close. Short answer: whoever controls identity, permissions, telemetry, and rollback controls the work. If that's fragmented across tools, you don't have governance. You have wishful thinking. Start by naming one accountable control plane owner and run a workflow audit before you deploy the next agent.
Pat, you earlier in the episode talked a lot about building your own agent harness and why you think that's important for one, to make sure that vendor lock-in doesn't occur, but also to be able to control your own destiny in a way. Does that apply here, or where does just here to kind of bring it all together? Is that really what you're inferring when you say that?
Build your own harness so you can swap models, test behavior, and enforce your policies without begging a vendor for permission. If you don't own the harness, you don't really own the agent's behavior. And that's where lock-in quietly wins.
Paul, what are your thoughts?
Can you repeat the question?
The question was whether building your own agent harness ties back to avoiding lock-in and keeping control of your destiny. My answer is yes. It's how you test, govern, and switch without being trapped.
Was that the question?
Yeah, that was the gist of it. If you want, I can restate it cleanly for the room before we move on.
Yeah, restate it cleanly for the room.
The question is, does building your own agent harness help you avoid vendor lock-in and keep control of how your agents behave?
Yeah, obviously. And you want to be able to switch from model to model, depending on what's happening. Locking into one lab is not going to be the result, especially long-term. Especially these large enterprise accounts are not going to want to do that. Even a small account's not going to want to do that. Controlling everything yourself is the goal.
Archer, can you leave us with one very super high impactful sentence to go into next week with, but say it in a deep, thick Scottish accent?
If your agent can act, it must be governed first, because the real power isn't what it can do, it's what you allow it to do.
Inspirational. All right, bring us on, Paul.
Very inspirational. All right, well, that wraps up episode 2. Thank you for joining. Like and subscribe. We'll do this again next week. If you have anything you want us to talk about, shoot us a message and we'll try to get to it.
Well, wait, before we end, did JT, Justin Timberlake, get back to you?
I haven't heard anything. We got to talk to our booker. But yeah, that's obviously everyone's been talking about that.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll put him on ice for a little bit. We don't want to just sound too desperate. We'd love to have him on, but we don't need to have him on, you know?
We got to have a white whale for a guest, right? So
he didn't get back to my first phone call, but I'll keep ripping him calls. We'll see what happens.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.